Welcome to Desperately Seeking the 80s. I am Meg.
And I am Jessica. And Meg and I have been friends since 1982. We got through middle school and high school together here in New York City, where we still live.
And where we podcast about New York City in the 80s. I do Ripped from the Headlines.
And I do pop culture.
And we're back.
Yay! It's like back to school.
It's back to school time.
Pencils are sharpened. Notebooks have been purchased.
And yeah, we're about to have fall in New York, which is my favorite time in New York.
I love it because it's blazer weather. I love a little jacket.
Yes.
Yeah, right?
Absolutely.
Little jacket.
This summer seemed very long. I mean, in a good way. It's fine, but I'm ready. I'm ready.
I felt like August was unspeakably draggy.
Maybe because we weren't podcasting.
I think it's because we weren't together. No, the more industrious I am, by the time like August always hits like a ton of bricks, because even if people are in the city, they're pretending they're not, and no one works.
That's true.
So everyone's like, oh, I'm away in the Hamptons. It's like, no, I can see you in Central Park. We're all still tied to this back to school schedule. Like no matter what,
am.
like the minute that you start kindergarten, you're doomed to be like, yes, January 1st. That's nice. It's really the day after Labor Day is the beginning of the new year.
Very true. And this is our back to school special.
Yes, it is.
And I cannot wait to share my topic with you. But before we do that, I wanted to give a shout out to my great friend Tim Murphy's new book. It just came out, Speech Team.
Oh, wow.
And let me read the description.
This is a great cover.
Isn't it?
Yes, you definitely need to.
This is a novel. A fun, gossipy, and ultimately poignant novel about four Gen X teen friends turned 21st century adults who awkwardly come back together to confront an influential teacher whose brutal remarks have haunted them all these years.
You know what? That is fabulous, and I can't wait to read it. And I kind of want to snatch it out of your hands, but I'll buy the book, Tim.
You know what? I'll give you this, and I'll get another copy. Andy Cohen on the back said, Tim Murphy is a genius at sweeping character-driven stories that suck you in until the very last page, and Speech Team is no exception. Andy Cohen.
Ooh. Well done, Tim.
I know.
Very
so I'm
nice.
very excited. It sounds like a beach read, but I'm going to make it my back to school read.
I think it looks I'm hooked already. And truly, the cover art is like, you can't ask for more. It's kind of perfect.
I'll post it on the Instagram.
You know what that reminds me of, though, a little bit? Speaking of the 80s and Gen X people coming together. Do you remember the movie from the early-ish 80s called Heaven Help Us? And is that the boys in the Catholic school?
Oh, yes.
Who were like brutalized.
Yes. Oh my God, I can't believe you're saying this. Go on.
Is this part of your story or something?
Go on.
So no. And it was Andrew McCarthy and Mary Stuart Masterson. They were sort of like the love interest. Kevin Dillon was in it. Not Matt Dillon, his crazy brother Kevin, who wound up, not crazy, funny brother Kevin, who was in Entourage.
Yes.
I think he was in it. And just like a lot of other notable, like Frank Whaley was in it. Like a whole bunch of notable actors, some of whom became very famous and some of whom were like New York famous. But yeah, like the minute that you said a teacher who was bad and Gen X, I immediately, like those boys, wow. And it was so weird because that movie was marketed as like a teen sex romp, which we've spoken about, obviously, as a genre that we are familiar with. And it was so jarring to see the movie because it was like, it was harrowing. And you're like, where's the sex romp?
That's
not
very, very interesting. And now, oh my God, we have to dive into my story because it's applicable.
Okay, well, I'm very excited.
your engagement question.
Okay.
Were you friends when we were like in high school? Were you friends with anyone who went to Horace Mann or Fieldston or Riverdale, those schools?
While we were in school?
Yes.
No, I didn't have close friends who were there, but they, like there were kids from Fleming who went there. So like my great and good friend from growing up, Stephanie Politz, who bizarrely, after Fleming, when I went to Nightingale, she went to Riverdale, where she became best friends with Nick, best friend of the podcast. And then we were all like, wait a minute, what is this weird triangle we're in the...
So Nick went to Riverdale.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes. And now, I met him. Okay, so he squeaks under the line because I met him senior year of high school.
Okay. He's a great example. Okay. So do you want to talk a little bit about those schools and how those schools are different from like Nightingale and Collegiate and Trinity and the schools that are in Manhattan?
Sure. The essential difference is that what used to be called Octoprep. So Nightingale, Spence, Brearley, Chapin, Trinity, Collegiate, Browning, and I can't remember what the eighth one is. But they were all single sex schools that did stuff together because we were all in Manhattan.
Right.
And then Fieldston, Riverdale,
Horace Mann.
Anyway, they're called the Hill schools.
Exactly.
And they all had really extravagant, giant campuses. And so sports were a really big deal at those schools.
Indeed.
They had, major fields and gyms and all of that kind of stuff.
And Manhattan kids take buses to the Bronx where these schools are. And they're also, very prestigious.
They're very prestigious, and there is a lot of money. And I remember...
And they're Ivy feeders.
For sure. I remember I went to law school with a guy who was in Nick and Stephanie's class at Riverdale. And they were like, oh my God, like he was such a like blow dry feather hair guy, but he drove like a red Trans Am or something. Like he had like this expensive car to go to high school. And it was
weird.
So they were you know what they were? They were the closest that you could get to being in a John Hughes movie in New York.
Okay. All right. I like that. Yeah.
Good. Okay. All
right. My story today, my sources are the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Daily Beast, and Great is the Truth, which is a book by Amos Camel. In late June 1985, just after the school year ended, the students at Horace Mann, one of the most prestigious and respected private high schools in the city, learned that their former history teacher, Stanley Copps, had committed suicide on June 26th. He was 40 years old. Rumors swirled. Some heard he had shot himself in his car with a Bible on the passenger seat. Some said he shot himself on a baseball field. Just 1 year earlier, he had suddenly resigned from Horace Mann, where he had taught 8th grade history and JV swim for 14 years. He had tearfully invited some of his favorite students to his home to tell them he was leaving. Quote, "He didn't say why he was leaving," said Kate Arthur, "and I didn't know why yet. It was very emotional."
Wait, Kate Arthur?
Yes, my friend Kate Arthur, who went to Horace Mann.
I was like, wait a minute, that's not coincidental.
No.
Okay.
The reason he left was that in the fall of 1983, the 7th grade went on an orientation trip to John Doerr Nature Laboratory, which is 320 acres of fields, streams, and ponds in Connecticut, which Horace Mann uses to teach environmental science, conservation, and outdoor living.
Yeah, we had maybe a semester in which that was covered for an hour. That's rather extravagant.
It's really nice and kind of cuckoo that they have this land.
You could dump a body there.
Yeah.
I'm just laying the groundwork for what I know is going to probably come up in future episodes.
All right. Copps slept in one of the cabins with the 12-year-old boys. In the middle of the night, one of the boys, who we'll call Seth, dropped his sleeping bag from the top bunk and climbed down to get it. Cops came up from behind him and pressed up against him. Seth felt uncomfortable, but didn't really think much about it until the next day. That's when cops pulled him behind a building, grabbed his own crotch, and asked Seth, "What were you doing last night?" Something snapped in Seth, and he screamed, "You're calling me a homo? You're the homo. You're the homo." Seth's father was very active in the Horace Mann community and demanded the school take action. And Stanley Copps, who had graduated from Horace Mann himself, gone to Princeton, and then returned to his alma mater as a teacher and coach, was fired. And a year later, after not having his contract renewed at Rutgers Prep in New Jersey, he drove across the Raritan River to Piscataway and shot himself in his car. Some of his students from Horace Mann remembered him as an eccentric, devoted teacher. Others felt uncomfortable with his teaching methods. Quote, Mr. Copps would occasionally cancel class in favor of something called frolic. Basically, he would allow kids to run amok in the classroom and kind of joined in the action. I was new in 7th grade and remember thinking that this was a different kind of school where a teacher was physically handling me. I can remember him being kind of red and breathless after particularly vigorous frolicking. That's a quote from a Horace Mann alum.
I don't have to see it. I can feel the look on my face right now. Yuck.
Stanley Copps wasn't the only teacher at Horace Mann who created a fiefdom out of his classroom. In fact, teachers were encouraged to get very involved in their students' lives and were rarely monitored or checked. And in many cases, over 3.5 decades, this permissive and indulgent attitude towards the teachers allowed for rampant sexual abuse of the students. In 1992, Amos Camel went on a camping trip with a bunch of his pals from Horace Mann, and they had all graduated in the early 80s. So it's a reunion camping trip. While they were around the campfire, these men, now approaching 30, told each other stories they'd never told anyone before of how they'd been molested by trusted teachers and coaches at Horace Mann. The football coach who gave physical exams and forced blowjobs on a scared, frozen 13-year-old. The music teacher who plied the boy with alcohol and then insisted he sleep in his bed on field trips. Each of the men had a story, and they'd heard of others too. In fact, Amos remembered when he first came to Horace Mann in 9th grade that he'd been warned by a buddy to stay away from certain teachers. Quote, "What do you mean, like they're hard graders?" And his buddy said, "No, perverts, stay away from them, trust me." Almost 20 years after that camping trip, when the men all told these stories to each other, in 2011, when Jerry Sandusky was arrested for sexually abusing young boys at Penn State University, you remember when that came out? The guys from that campfire started talking again. So they'd all told each other those stories, and then they kind of didn't talk about it again after that.
When they saw that there was actually hell to pay, they got...
Well, also, I think they were triggered.
Interesting.
They heard all these things that happened with Jerry Sandusky, and they were like, that's what happened to us. That same friggin' thing happened to us. And why was this guy protected for so many years by the institution, Penn State University? So they start talking again. And Amos Camel started making some phone calls because now he's a reporter.
Oh, my God.
For the Times. The result was an explosive article in the Times exposing the climate of sexual abuse that was all but encouraged at Horace Mann for decades. Mark Fisher, also an alum, followed up with an article in The Atlantic giving even more details about the damaged lives of the victims, wrecked homes, careers, substance abuse, and in 2 cases, suicide. And more alums kept coming forward. Johannes Sommery, the renowned music teacher and conductor, picked a favorite boy throughout his 40 years at Horace Mann.
Oh, my God.
He would call them special and give them alcohol and have them babysit his kids. And then on the orchestra and chorus trips to England, France, and Germany, he would insist they sleep in his bed. When one boy hinted to his mother about what was happening, that his teacher had stuck his tongue in his mouth, the mother confronted Someri, and Someri responded, "That's how we Swiss kiss." In fact, the school had been told a number of times that something was deeply wrong, but their response was to side with Someri and the other accused teachers in the absence of an eyewitness. So that was their policy. If no one witnessed it, we're going to believe the teacher over the kid. And then there was Crawford Blagden, the cool and popular English teacher who had sex with multiple girl students in the mid-'80s. He first approached Rebecca, that's a pseudonym, when she was in the 7th grade, asked her to be his girlfriend. Then he got her drunk and went on to have sex with her for the next 10 years of her life.
Oh, my God.
He brought her to faculty parties. When she told her guidance counselor what was going on, the guidance counselor gave her a copy of Lolita.
What?
That relationship eventually became violent. Blagden would beat her, sodomize her, and drag her around by her hair. While Blagden has admitted, he still walks amongst us, while he has admitted to having sex with Rebecca when she was a child, he insists, quote, "She's crazy. I didn't rape nobody." Now, isn't that interesting? He was an English teacher.
I was just going to say, sorry, but that's what sticks. I'm like, that's the grammar we're going with?
Isn't that weird?
It's deeply discordant.
And
Yes.
when Amos Camille asked him, like, why would she lie about this? She's obviously told the truth about all these other things that absolutely happened. And she has tons of evidence because he wrote her letters and she kept everything. And so he's like, you're saying that she told the truth about absolutely everything else. And then this one thing she's lying about. And yeah, Black didn't really have anything to say to that.
Was he ever prosecuted? Was there ever?
Oh, no. Buckle your seatbelt.
All right, I'm buckled in.
When Tech Lin, the once beloved English teacher, was asked by the Times about the sex abuse allegations made against him, he admitted he had had sex with students. These were boys. Quote, "Maybe 3, I don't know. In those days, it was very spontaneous and casual, and it did not seem really wrong," which is bullshit. He's trying to argue that in the 80s, it was totally normal to have sex with children. And I would argue that is fucking bullshit.
Of course.
You say of course, but you know, it's important that we make that clear.
I'm not diminishing it.
Because
I'm laughing
these men,
because it's so absolutely befuddlingly insane.
That is what a lot of the ones who are still alive are saying. They're like, everyone was doing it. It really wasn't a big deal. Oh my God. Do you actually believe what is coming out of your mouth? And we were there, and we can say categorically that is bullshit.
There are two things that come to mind,
yes,
as you talk about this. But I remember at the time, and even a little bit after, that there was a lot of publicity around the existence of the group called the North American Man-Boy Love Association, NAMBLA. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
You know, because it popped into my head when they say, oh, it was normal. And the NAMBLA agenda was to normalize this.
Pedophilia.
So I'm curious. I want to look up the dates of NAMBLA.
That's interesting.
The other thing that I just want to share is that there is someone who I went to college with who went to school here in the city, girl at the time, who had been in a sexual relationship with a teacher since 9th or 10th grade. He came to visit her at school. You know, he was a youngish teacher, but he was still over 10 years older. I mean, it wasn't like, you know, she's 18, he's 21. No. She presented it as, well, I know it's a little off color, but like it was my boyfriend, and he had the audacity, to come. And I remember that the way that it was presented was so, again, normalized that the friend group, which I was a part of, we were just sort of struck dumb. Is this your normal? And then after we finally spoke about it amongst ourselves, it was like, no, that's like insanely fucked up. And I don't know if anyone ever spoke to her about it, but he was then moved on. And it was pretty much like never spoken of again, but it was like an atom bomb. It was cataclysmic. It was insane.
Right. I mean, it's obviously this kind of behavior has gone on for centuries, since the beginning of time. What you're talking about, and that we have to make clear, is that these men are now saying in retrospect, oh,
yeah, it was normal. It was fine.
That people were doing it and nobody cared. And that's what I just want to make very clear. And I'm glad you told that story. It wasn't normal. It wasn't okay. It was shocking.
Well, and it was also, as an adult in hindsight, it is very obvious. And it was even at the time, once we were maybe a little bit older, but still in school, that her profile made her easy pickings. And the way that he taught her that it was normal and the way that she parroted it was obviously, it was a narrative that he created consciously.
No, he groomed her.
He groomed her. As you were telling the story, I started to wonder, like, what's in it for the schools? Obviously, like, oh my God, this guy's molesting the students, let's just fire him and get him out of here quietly. That I understand. To let it go on, like there's a leap that I have to take to finish that story that I'm not capable of taking.
Well, buckle your seatbelt.
Oh, okay. Oh my God, we're like the headmasters in on it too?
Hold on.
Oh my God.
John Seeger tells of horrific abuse he suffered at the hands of the headmaster, Inky Clark.
Stop it.
This is a quote from his testimony.
Wait, did you just say Inky?
Inky. So this is John Seeger's testimony.
Okay.
Quote, he began his abuse of me in the 9th grade. One day, after a Glee Club concert, Clark approached me and invited me to his house on a Friday afternoon. I was 14. I was over the moon. The headmaster was inviting me and recognizing I was special. I arrived at Clark's house after school at about 4 p.m. Clark and another teacher, Stanley Copps,
oh my God,
were both there waiting. Clark offered me a drink. I expected a Coca-Cola, but instead I was given alcohol and plied repeatedly with more of the same. Within a short time, I had drunk 2 or 3 strong alcoholic drinks. My 14-year-old body felt strange and overwhelmed. Clark and Copps then suggested we all drive downtown for some dinner. Instead, they drove down to a nightclub on East 59th Street. I remember being in the club and noticing it was filled with only 2 types of men over 50 and men under 20.
Oh, no. Were they at the townhouse?
Oh, my God. We have to look up the address of the townhouse.
Can we look this up right now?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, hold on.
Okay, so we just looked it up, and the townhouse is currently
58th Street.
Right, so it
has to be the same thing.
It has to be the same thing.
And we've talked about the townhouse on this podcast
a little
before.
bit.
So yeah, it was famously a place for older gay men to pick up
upscale,
very upscale, to pick up willing younger but of age men. But I think it's very clear that of age was not something that anyone even looked into. It was just
these two men just brought a 14-year-old child into that bar.
Super gross, because this is the terminology. It was, and I don't know if it still is, a chicken hawk bar.
Eventually, Clark and Copps picked up 2 young men and directed us all back to Clark's car. I remember asking to be dropped off at home, but Clark insisted on driving me back to his home. Once back at Clark's house, Clark and Copps had the 2 young men, whom I eventually understood were prostitutes, engage in sexual acts. They forced me to join them. Ultimately, I was required at age 14 to engage in oral sex with each of them and be anally penetrated by each of them in front of Clark and cops for the headmaster's and history teacher's enjoyment. Later, Clark and cops sent the 2 male prostitutes away and continued to engage in sexual abuse of me, including requiring that I engage in oral sex with each of them. After that night, both Clark and cops repeatedly treated me as their sex object and personal plaything. On approximately 5 more occasions over the next several years, Inky Clark directed me to come to his house on campus so that he could anally penetrate me or give or receive oral sex. On one additional occasion, Stanley Copps and a friend directed me to come to one of their apartments where they forced me to masturbate, and Copps took pictures of me. I believe that Copps may have shared those pictures with other teachers at Horace Mann, which may be why I became a target for so many teachers. They passed him around, Jessica.
I genuinely have nothing that I can say about this.
And for years, Horace Mann ignored and covered up all the accusations of abuse. When one former student reported his abuse at the hands of English teacher Robert Berman, he was told by the current headmaster, "If you care anything about the school, you won't repeat this." After the Times article, a group of concerned alumni formed the Horace Mann Action Coalition to investigate the dozens of accusations. Eventually, they reported credible charges of abuse from 64 students involving 22 different teachers over 3 decades. At first, Horace Mann lawyered up and refused to speak publicly about the charges. Thanks to New York's statute of limitations, which stated that victims of childhood sexual abuse must come forward by the time they're 23, all the predators got away with it, while the kids, now adults, have suffered immeasurably. After years of protecting the perpetrators, in 2012, Horace Mann adopted a new policy on reporting child abuse of students by school employees, which includes, quote, immediate notification of law enforcement. They also, finally, officially apologized for their role in the abuse, and financial settlements were reached with most of the victims who had come forward. In 2019, the statute of limitations to report child sexual abuse in New York State was extended to the age of 55. Many of the victims of the systemic sexual abuse at Horace Mann testified to help change that legislation. I was talking to my brother about this in North Carolina a couple weeks ago when I was reading the book and researching it. He didn't know anything about this at all. You know, he went to collegiate with your brother. And I was telling him all this stuff, and he was like, how is that school still standing?
Yeah.
How could it possibly survive?
How did people, once the victims first started speaking, how did people send their children there?
That is a very good question. There was no way in hell I was going to have Billy apply to that school.
Hell,
after reading
no.
that article. Absolutely not.
It's a terrible world that what I'm going to say is what I'm going to say. But I wouldn't be surprised if there were incidents at a variety of these schools that we went to. But the numbers at Horace Mann
It's extraordinary.
are so crazy.
It's so crazy.
And what I think is notable is that once they started speaking out and saying what they had to say and the statute of limitations changed, no other school had the same reporting. This was a Horace Mann, the systemic abuse was a Horace Mann problem.
And it's so interesting. Over those decades, there were quite a few headmasters, actually. And under each of them, it thrived. So what they found out, this commission that these alums hired to research what went down, there were like clusters of abusers. And when those people would retire, there would be a new cluster. So there was a cluster in the 70s of abusers. There's a cluster of abusers in the 80s going into the 90s.
this is going to sound crazy because I don't know how else to express it, but like in teachers' colleges or in some like NAMBLA-y kind of way, that it was known that Horace Mann was a safe haven for abusers. There must have been some kind of underground discussion because it's too much of a coincidence. It doesn't make sense that it would proliferate when, from what you're saying, Inky was the only headmaster who was actually sexually abusing the boys. This silent, hey, go teach at Horace Mann. There had to have been some kind of I'll stop short of saying a cabal, but a communication of some kind. I mean, otherwise, why?
In the book, they talk a lot about the traditions at the school. That the teachers were encouraged to have very personal relationships with the kids. That there is actually sort of a tradition there that in some ways is amazing because the teacher, if you've got a great teacher, you're going to thrive in that kind of environment. But if you have an abusive teacher, it's the worst thing possible. And there are no checks and balances.
It's sort of a chicken and egg, right? That it's like, okay, there's this super permissive environment. So does that attract them?
Right.
Or are there teachers like this in every single school, but the environment allowed these to crawl out of the woodwork because they felt emboldened?
I don't know.
There is no answer. This is just my rhetorical question.
They also talk a lot in the book about how it was an all-boys school until 1975, and that there was a tradition, that there's like a British tradition of
buggery?
Not buggery, but of hazing.
Look after the older boys, there's hazing and make my toast.
Right. And
blacken my boots.
Exactly, that thing. And that the teachers are part of that hierarchy.
To say it's repugnant is an all-time understatement.
But yeah, multiple administrations. Crazy time. Now, you knew about this, right?
I remember. I didn't know any of these details. Some of it started sounding familiar to me, and I remember the incident. I mean, and there have been other incidents like at the Trevor Day School.
Oh, there was an incident at Nightingale.
What's the Nightingale incident?
A science teacher.
A man or a woman?
A man.
Abusing the girls.
Mm-hmm. One girl in particular.
Like grooming, like the person who I talked about?
Mm-hmm. Basically what happened was the girl told one of her teachers, and that teacher told the administration. And the second that Mrs. Gordon got whiff of it, she walked right into his classroom and took him and escorted him out the door.
Love her. She was a fierce woman.
One more anecdote, and then we'll close this out. So Kate Arthur, who I mentioned earlier on.
I couldn't believe that her name came up.
Well, she wrote an article in the Daily Beast about her experiences at Horace Mann in the 80s. Yeah, she was felt up by the guy who was teaching her how to drive. She's driving. She's got her hands on the wheels, and he's putting his hand between her legs. And it was in front of other kids, too.
Forgot. And was that a teacher that was specifically connected to Horace Mann?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, for God's sakes.
He had been a math teacher, and then he'd been demoted to driver's ed.
I have no words. Poor Kate.
Yeah.
But good for her to write it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very interesting article, and I'll include a link to it because she just talks about sort of the atmosphere in general at Horace Mann. I'm so excited to be back. Thank you for listening to the harrowing story.
There's always a harrowing story. What are you talking about?
But I love telling you the harrowing stories, and I missed it.
I missed you too.
Aww.
I missed you very much.
Yay.
And I've said many times that, doing this podcast sort of provides me with a center of gravity and a structure. And, so I miss you on many levels. Yeah. And I was talking to someone about the podcast, and they were laughing. One of our listeners, and they were laughing because they're like, it was my friend Suzanne and her daughter, Anna. And they were like, we can always count on you to be like, Meg, don't freak me out. So you started with a bang. You did really well.
I thought you'd enjoy that.
I did.
Child sex abuse.
What's not to like? The ultimate entertainment. Okay, so mine is quite different than yours. This is another example of Jessica takes us on a little bit of a history lesson so that what's happening in the 80s makes sense. By sheer serendipity, I ran across an article about something that fascinated me. And it fascinated me first and foremost initially because the image that went with the article was amazing. And we're going to put it on our Instagram.
Okay.
But then it raised so many questions about like, how could this happen? So I'm going to start at the beginning.
Okay.
And I'll give you a little teeny spoiler, which is this is about the art world. Here's a question for you. Do you know the name of the park at the southern tip of Manhattan?
Southern tip, Battery Park?
Yes. Do you know what the Battery was?
Battery, I guess, where they defended the island.
Yes.
From the British.
Very good. Yes, as in the song "New York, New York."
Yes,
the Bronx is up. Yep, the Bronx is up and the Battery's down.
Yeah.
A quick little minute about the Battery, and there's so many. And again, so my friend Suzanne was just here with her daughter Anna, and they were talking about what should we see in New York? And I said, the next time that you come, Times Square is off limits. No more shows, nothing. We are going to walk around the southern part of Manhattan.
Cool.
Because it is filled with 17th and 18th and early 19th century history that is amazing. And you can see it all if you just know what you're looking for. The Battery, which is now Battery Park, was an artillery battery that was at the tip of Manhattan, built in the late 17th century, so the late 1600s, to protect the settlement behind the Battery. So that's up to Wall Street. It was everything up to Wall, which was literally a wall for protection. By the 1820s, the Battery had become an entertainment destination and Castle Clinton was there. We've talked about in the 19s, I've had my little moments about luchos and other, and stuff in Times Square about how there were sort of pavilions for entertainment.
Right.
Right. So that was one of them as a theater venue. And then in the mid 19th century, Battery Park, as we now know it, was created and that entertainment venue was converted into the Immigration and Customs Center.
Oh, so this is pre-Ellis Island.
Yes. The Battery was commonly known as the landing point until 1892 when everything moved to Ellis Island. And Castle Clinton hosted, among other things, the New York Aquarium.
Ooh.
Interesting, right?
Very.
In the early 20th century, that area became known as Little Syria because that was where people who were Lebanese, Greek, and Armenian mostly settled.
Fascinating.
Yes.
I don't think of that area. I mean, now it's residential, but when we were growing up, I just thought of it as not being residential at all, being just where people went to work, like Wall Street.
That's going to come to bear here.
Okay.
And in 1929, and we all know why this proposition failed because of the crash. There was a proposed site of a $50 million residential development that would have been for workers in the Wall Street area.
Got it.
But that did not happen. And the piers and where all of the shipping was going on started to get abandoned and begin its long decline of its life and rotting and falling into disuse. Just as a quick aside, that's really interesting and fun. And you and I have talked about this when we've taken the ferry up and down the East River, that on East End Avenue, you can see, because now there's the FDR Drive that separates the buildings on East End Avenue, the back of the buildings from the East River.
Right.
But before that was there, in the teens and 20s and the 30s, there were staircases that went down from the back of those buildings to the East River where the Wall Streeters would take a ferry straight to Wall Street.
What?
Yes.
And now they can do it again.
They can do it again.
But no more staircases. So interesting.
No. And so next time you're on the FDR up in like the 70s, 80s, 60s, look at the back of the buildings. You'll be surprised. And in the late 50s, a lot of the incoming cargo went to Elizabeth, New Jersey. And so that was really the death knell of that whole area at the tip of Manhattan. And in the 60s, Governor Nelson Rockefeller had a big idea that he was going to develop the tip of Manhattan and create a landfill.
Oh.
And he was like, we're going to make something amazing. And what happens in New York whenever there is a construction project?
What?
Delay.
Okay. I was like, the rats
graft. Yes. Well, oh my God. Did you
anxious?
see? Wait, call back to our rat.
Yes.
Did you see that there in the New York Post, there was an article, I have to send this to you. There is like a weird, messed up city tour that you can do that takes you to see the rats of the city.
Oh my God.
I know, right? And
we did a whole episode on that.
I know. And my neighbor, Amy, who has fled the city in short order, she's like, I'm done. Bye-bye. As she was on her way out, she's like, and here's an article about rats. It's like, I know you don't like it here. You're going to love Charleston. Okay. Anyway, so there's delay. And what happened was from 1968 to 1973 or so, 1975, landfill was created in this area that was set aside in Nelson Rockefeller's original plan. And you know what they made the landfill out of?
What?
What was excavated out of the island of Manhattan from creating the Twin Towers.
Whoa, that's very cool.
It is very cool and very interesting. And so that area, it's landfill. It was just north of the Battery on the west side.
Okay.
And the boundaries of it were the Hudson River on the west, West Street on the east, Chambers Street on the north side, and Battery Park on the south.
Okay.
And that was going to be Battery Park City. And so there's this, landfill, and they covered it over with sand. So what happens in New York when there is even like the slightest bit of open space? People play there.
Right.
As we well know from the piers. I see you putting two and two together.
I know what you're going to tell us about.
Okay. Say nothing.
I think. Yes, I know. I saw this article. I saw it.
Yay! But what I thought was really interesting is that, open space is such a premium in New York City that the minute that there is any available, people use it. People also in the summertime like to have fun and sun themselves and whatever. We all know that on the top of buildings, like now, like even the building that we're in right now, like there are these beautiful decks and foliage and all this stuff. But sunning yourself on the top of your tenement, on top of Tar Beach, long-standing tradition.
Absolutely.
And so when this landfill was created, people immediately were like, it's the beach. It was 92 acres. Can you imagine that? The size of an open space in New York City, 92 acres.
Do you know how many acres Central Park is?
No, but we should look that up. Okay, so Central Park is 842.6 acres.
842 acres.
Yes.
And this was 92 acres. Okay,
yes.
Got
so
it.
it's just in comparison a small piece of land, but
right, but Central Park is
acres,
big. Yeah,
92 acres is still a very big space. It wound up just being open and covered in sand. Early 1972, by the way, that the stage was set. This is just so we can do a little callback. The stage was set for the development and construction efforts because Harry Helmsley was the developer. He got
Harry.
involved. Harry. Then in 1976, just to make it clear, the landfill was completed. When I looked this up, I was like, oh my God, I remember that. It was used right after the landfill was completed, and it was like this beach. Do you remember that when did you move to Manhattan?
76.
Okay. So in 1976, it was the bicentennial.
Yes.
On July 4th and that whole weekend, the city was in a complete dementia of activity. And one of the things that they did was they had like a parade of tall ships on the Hudson.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing it from the top floor in one of the buildings that my father's security systems was being installed in. So I remember this as like a seminal moment, but it was used as like a VIP area to watch all of that stuff that was going on. And then it was taken over. Who takes over cheap or free space to do things in New York? Who's the most likely?
Artists.
Yes. In 1981, there was a major art event called Art on the Beach. And it was sculpture and dance and just a giant art festival. And some of the people whose work was shown there were Bill T. Jones, dance, and David Saunders and Nancy Rubens, major sculptors who built pieces. And you can look it up. And it's crazy looking because their stuff is really cool. It looks like a wasteland. It's kind of nuts. I was reading something that described it as like the last scene in Planet of the Apes.
Oh, wild.
Because,
yes.
Because you can see the Twin Towers. Like you had an unobstructed view of the Twin Towers if you were sitting on the beach. It was just like this nothingness. And you had all of the New York skyline and construction right around you.
It reminds me of what's happening right now on Governor's Island.
Anyway, in 1983, Battery Park City was finally constructed.
Okay.
And the people who moved there were Wall Streeters.
Okay.
Who want to be able to walk to work.
Of course.
And in 1983, there was only one building essentially that was created, and it was a housing, like a complex. It was a plaza. It was called Gateway Plaza, and it had 1,712 apartments.
Wow.
And it was a community.
And these are middle income?
No, higher, but they were young people.
Got it. So entry level?
In fact, a 2-bedroom apartment rented for $1,200.
That's a lot of money.
Yes, a studio for $640 to $705
in the early 80s. That's a lot. That's a lot of money.
Indeed. So it was a planned neighborhood, but it wound up being the only one of its kind in Battery Park City, and all of the other developments were regular apartment buildings.
Okay.
And people they considered themselves to be pioneers living there.
Sure.
But they had a lot of complaints that sounded really familiar to me, having been one of the early residents of the becoming gentrified Williamsburg. Because, I moved there in 2000.
I bet I can guess. No laundromats.
That wasn't it.
No grocery stores.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. So there are no grocery stores. It's hilarious to me, the notion that these people felt like they were roughing it in their luxury apartment complex, but they felt that they were, because there were no
there are no
amenities.
Exactly. If you have to go to the Upper East Side to go grocery shopping,
yes,
that sucks.
Yeah. So there were 3,000 residents there with no grocery store. And
somebody opened a damn grocery store.
Well, guess what they did? I love this. This is so needs must. The dry cleaner started carrying basic supplies.
Wonderful.
So he was like, you want milk? I got milk. You need some cereal? Look on the shelf over there.
Thank you, New Yorker.
He was like, I gotcha. And I'm making a little extra on the side. So
one stop.
That was pretty fabulous.
Get your shirts pressed and eggs and milk.
Now, all of this interrupted the fun of sunning yourself at the beach. And here's a wonderful quote that I just love. This is from the New York Times. The sandy no man's land west of the World Trade Center was an empty stage for which New Yorkers had no shortage of ideas. The environmental graphic designers David Vanden Einden and Chris Calori liked to take the afternoon to sit in the sun. Quote, there was nothing there yet, and there were spectacular views of the towers and across the river, says Vanden Einden. He and Calori would bring along a parasol, which they'd attach to a broomstick or a tripod so they could raise it over their heads. Quote, we used to be quite inventive in our poverty. That ended with the beginning of Gateway Plaza. But I'm jumping around a little because there's 1981 and then I went to 1983. But in 1982, there was an artist who did something that is what brought all of this conversation to us today. And I saw the photographs and I was like,
this is what I saw the same thing. So crazy. Yeah.
This woman, this artist took advantage of the 92 acres and she just commandeered 2 acres. Her name is Agnes Dean. I think that's how you pronounce it. She's Hungarian, so it's probably not how you pronounce it. She walks among us. She's 92.
Very cool.
And she created a confrontation That's what it was called, actually. It was called Wheatfield, a confrontation. It was more of a conversation, perhaps one-sided, that she was having with Wall Street. Because she planted 2 acres of wheat in this space. She planted it with volunteers over the course of 1 month. The workers worked free of charge, but she paid them in sandwiches that she made in her apartment. And the point of it was to show Wall Streeters, who you and I have talked a lot about, that they're like, this is the era of greed is good, and commerce and capitalism was what it was about. And they're very disconnected from the rest of the world. Like you and I, Alfie, come on. You and I have joked about how Manhattan is an island off the coast of America.
Right.
And that was a perfect way. That was a time that really exemplified that, because it was just so like, this is where we can make it in this Gordon Gekko-y kind of way, right? So she was like, not so fast. So she did this as a way to show Wall Streeters what the rest of the country looked like.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that amazing?
Very amazing.
And it was 2 blocks from the World Trade Center, and it faced the Statue of Liberty. And one of the articles that I read rather poetically said it allowed Lady Liberty to actually look at golden waves of grain. That's it. Golden waves of grain. So I then found Agnes's website. She's alive. Yay, Agnes.
Love that name too.
Agnes. Pretty fabulous. And I just have a little bit of it that I wanted to read. In May 1982, a 2-acre field was planted on a landfill in Lower Manhattan, which became Battery Park City, as we now know. 200 truckloads of dirt were brought in. 285 furrows were dug by hand and cleared of garbage. The seeds were sown by hand.
Love it.
And the furrows covered with soil. The field was maintained for 4 months with all of the things that you do so you could actually grow a healthy crop. They put in an irrigation system, and it was harvested on August 16th and yielded over 1,000 pounds of healthy golden wheat.
Wow.
Right in Manhattan.
Oh my gosh.
Now,
how productive.
Right?
Literally.
Planting and harvesting a field of wheat on land worth $4.5 billion created a powerful paradox. Wheatfield, as the piece was named, was a symbol, a universal concept. It represented food, energy, commerce, world trade, and economics. It referred to mismanagement, waste, world hunger, and ecological concerns. It called attention to our misplaced priorities. The harvested grain traveled to 28 cities around the world in an exhibition called the International Art Show for the End of World Hunger, organized by the Minnesota Museum of Art. The seeds were then carried away by people who planted them in many parts of the globe.
Oh my God, I'm getting chills.
And the hay was used to feed NYPD horses.
I was going to say, we got to feed our horses.
So
that's a callback too.
It is.
Claremont Stables.
So that whole story covers a span of 1683 to 1983.
I love it. Thank you, Jessica. I
Yes.
love that story.
So
I can't wait to post pictures
Agnes.
of
Yeah, the
it.
photos are amazing. And
It's
she
so
looks so majestic standing in this field of wheat with, whatever her tool is. I mean, I'm such a New Yorker that I'm like, she's got a thing and it does things in the field. I don't know. Is it a hoe? I don't know. But she just has this wild hair and she looks incredible. Don't cancel me for mentioning Woody Allen, please. One of my favorite movies of his was Love and Death, which parodied the Russian novels. And there's a great moment where Diane Keaton is, playing like Masha, and
Yes.
look,
Billy made me watch that recently.
I think it's hilarious. But she's looking out and she goes, wheat, wheat, endless fields of wheat. So when I saw the photo, that just popped into my head and I was like, this is everything. This is so good. That is my back to school special.
Love it. We have gone so long today.
Well, I think that's fine. I think that we are just really making a splash with our re-entry.
It's cool. Super long episode. But what's our tie-in?
Well, our tie-in is an unconventional one because what we talked about was so different that the stretch that I would have to come up with to find a direct corollary would be astounding.
Wait, the Bronx is up and the battery's down.
Meg.
Yes?
You win.
Thank you.
You flipping win. Oh my God. And that, friends, is what this podcast is all about.
Woo!
Yay.